resonates with you. You remember it clearly.
There's many stories like that. Like another time I went to a nightclub and a man said to me, "Oh, you know, what nationality are you?" And I said, "Oh, I'm mixed. I'm Filipino Serbian." And he said, "No, really, you know, what are you?" I said, "No, that's what I am." He says, "Well, why are you denying your heritage?" I said, "What do you mean?" He says, "I know you're Indian." And I was so upset that I went to the coat check and I showed him my ID and I said, "Does this last name look Indian to you?" And he still wouldn't stop. So it
Maybe he's just flirting with you.
that's not for me.
Yeah,
It wasn't working well.
It wasn't working.
I'm gathering everyone around the table, and Reiner, that you all have shared experiences and similar stories. And I want to give you a chance, if you want to share some with me and with our audience. Ravi, anyone stick out for
Well,
you?
I remember we went to Florida as a family. My mom has an aunt there, and we walked into a restaurant, the same sort of thing. Everyone just stopped and stared at us. And it makes me think about how my father did a lot of research in South Africa because he was a professor and studied multiculturalism and employment equity for interaction. That was his area of interest. And so it just makes me think about when he went with my mother to South Africa and they'd hold hands and walk by the beach, you know, after apartheid. The people must have looked at them and said, "Well, when did you guys get together exactly?" But yeah, I mean, there were some of those experiences growing up. I remember when we were in England, not so much, interestingly enough, in Hamilton where I grew up, because we grew up in the university community, and you know, a lot of the professors, you know, our friends were professors and parents were professors, and so they were from different places. So it was a bit of a bubble. So not so much in terms of my growing up there, but on a sabbatical of my dad's in England, I remember there were some kids and they you know, cried out a racial slur, you know, at my brother and I, and then we, you know, yelled back, you know, a swear. You know, we told them where to go, and then they immediately realized that we had North American accents. And oh, you must be American. They came over and they wanted to hang out with us, and so it was just, you know, I was in Manchester, you know, working class, and that was just so there were some things like that made me, you know, gave me pause. You know, I think about it. You know, people talk about going to East Germany. I say, well, you know, as someone with my identity, I read in the paper, maybe I'm more sensitive to it than others. There are certain places in the world I probably would, you know, I think twice about going to. I read about the neo-Nazis or skinheads. So there's those kinds of things that I think about. But for the most part, I think I'm pretty mainstream in terms of my day-to-day now.
Jean, forgive me for sounding insensitive if I do when I ask you this question, but unlike the other four of our guests on this show, Reiner can't see you, but to me you look Caucasian. When I look at you, you look Caucasian.
Yeah, well, and that's because there's a large part of me that is. Mm-hmm. So, you know, I mean, that's just the way it is. But I wanted to go back by way of, in a roundabout way, answering your question, to go back to something that Minelle said earlier, which is that this is a new phenomena, this mixed race thing. And I just want to completely contradict that and say it's absolutely not new. This country's based on that, and the people that I come out of, the Métis people of the northwest of Canada, are based on that idea. The idea that of basically white fur trade men, French and mostly Scottish, but mostly French, coming and marrying Indian women of various Indian tribes. So the mixture there is huge. We tend to think of Indians across Canada as sort of a pan, as if they're all one. And there are as many varieties of Indians in Canada as there are Europeans. I mean, the Mohawks are as different from the Cree as the Italians are from the Finns, right? So we've got all those different groups here to begin with. So you have mixed tribes or mixed nations already in this country to begin with. You bring French people over here, French men, and there are no white women, period, right? And it's not even choices, right? Mm-hmm. There's no white women. So you come over here and they're marrying Indian women. And then what happens in the creation of the Métis people is because they're not wanted on either side, right? The children, and originally called half-breeds, right? So, which is, I agree, a very pejorative term, because we don't breed people, right? We breed animals. And you can guess if you're a half-breed, which half is the human half and which half is the animal half, because it's sure not the white side that's going to be the animal that you're breeding here. So you're half-breeds because you're marrying, and our French term for les sauvages, right? You know, you're savages, you're half-breeds, you're every pejorative term you can think of. So, but that's not just white folks thinking, it's also Native American thinking too. They don't like it either. Nobody likes, and Minelle has a great term, she calls it relentless negativity, and towards the people in the middle. But what happened is, because the Métis aren't wanted by the Indians and they're not wanted by the Europeans, they had about 200 years to create their own society. So we have a whole new culture that grew up in the middle here, not wanted, not liked, and still to this day, not wanted to be acknowledged as existing from either side.
Minelle, I want to ask you, what is relentless negativity?
No, I think Jean's totally dead on. You know, at first I want to address the point, Jean's point around, you know, mixing is nothing new. We like to think that this is a really novel phenomenon, but what we're doing is prioritizing mixing between new immigrant groups and thinking that there hasn't been mixing going on for generations and generations. So I think that's really key, because we talk about mixed race, but we don't talk about the issues around anti-colonialism and thinking about how colonialism has played a huge role in the way that we've seen mixing all over the world. Because of course, mixing means different things in different places. What's happening in Korea around the mixing between Korean bachelors in rural areas is really interesting, because these Korean men in these rural areas can't find wives because the women are going to work in the urban areas. And so they're actually importing brides from Pakistan and the Philippines. And so this new breed is called Caucasians breed. You know,
Caucasians?
Caucasians, Koreans and Asians. And they're really stigmatized, and that goes back to this relentless negativity around the personification of mixed race people, and thinking about how it is that we've moved from this pervasive psychopathology, oh no, what about the kids, they must be torn and confused about their identity. Well, I don't think any of us wake up in the middle of the night going, oh, I'm so confused about who I am. We all know who we are. It's other people who have problems in terms of classifying us. They need to know who we are. They want to put us in a racial box.
Reiner, I want to ask you, you know, mixed unions and the offspring of them have been happening for decades and centuries and so on and so forth. But has the conversation changed? And if so, why?
The conversation hasn't changed. The conversation there are different conversations. The conversation amongst scholars has changed and evolved. The conversation amongst regular folks and amongst the media is very, very static. There were a slew of articles in the mid-1990s in the United States, put up by Time and Newsweek magazines primarily. This was when the U.S. was trying to decide whether or not to change its system of categorization to include a multiracial category, or to allow people to check as many as apply, which is what was eventually decided. And these Time and Newsweek articles were incredibly mawkish and actually quite insulting to the idea of mixed race identity, because it tended to infantilize people, the sorts of things that Minelle was just talking about. So there's this new series that the New York Times has been doing since January called Race Remixed. And when I read Race Remixed, I swear I could be reading Time or Newsweek from 15 or 17 years ago. It's absolutely the same. There's no change really, I think, in the national conversation in the United States. There's really been no change except to suggest that this is new, this is faddish, it's going to end race tomorrow, if not tomorrow, then the next day, which I think is really, really unfortunate.
When we think of race, Reiner, in the U.S., I think most people, it turns into a black and white issues. The conversation's still about that, or have we at least moved forward in that conversation?
It has, but there's some interesting dynamics in that. In the United States, mixed race advocacy organizations are just about always headed by suburban white women who are the mothers of black, white, mixed race children. Regardless, and this is interesting because in the United States, the smallest and slowest growing mixed faction is the black-white faction. But when, generally speaking, in the United States, it'll be acknowledged that there are sort of newer and different mixes coming along, but the narrative is always put in terms of the black-white narrative, and it's very, very, I won't say it's confusing, it's erroneous.
Ravi, go ahead.
Well, I have to jump in, just because, you know, I am actually a U.S. and Canadian citizen. I was born and raised in Canada. I did do a master's degree in the States, so I spent some time there, but I also visited the States constantly throughout my life because my family, my mom's family is all there in different states. So, but what's interesting to me is I think there might be, you know, in studying the United States also, you know, academically, and race issues, because I did a philosophy degree, and then I studied law in the States and in Canada, and looked at our different programs that we have. What strikes me about the United States and the United States experience is that it is a very segregated society. I mean, more so than in Canada, I think. And I think that the whole black-white thing is very, very pronounced. And you look at Obama, who kind of felt like he had to, choose the black identity in a way to sort of, create, to self-identify and just in terms of his own growing up. And I just think there may be a different sort of experience in Canada. Like we went to, I remember I made friends at